Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here today. I know I'm a complete stranger to all of you. And as a matter of fact, 2 weeks ago, I didn't even know Matt, your pastor. My friend Kevin Pauls works at Kildonan Community Church, which is a Presbyterian church on the other side of town. And we recently reconnected because our kids go to the same school. We grew up together at church in North Kildonan. And so I was guest preaching there, and somehow Matt heard about it. And Matt and I had a long chat at Starbucks the other day. I had to keep pushing back my meetings because we just enjoyed chatting so much. So I'm sure you know just how great Matt is. And thank you so much for having me here today. I'm just going to introduce myself very quickly so you know who I am. My name is Rafael. And probably the most important thing that you should know about me is that I have a family. And I have a picture with me today because since school started, we're all just cycling through colds after colds after colds, and also COVID tests that are all negative. But anyways, that's my family. I have 3 daughters and my lovely wife, and that pretty much is the most important thing in my life. So yeah, I just wanted to share that with you. And I used to work as a pastor in North Kildonan area. Now I work for an organization called Generation Rising, and you can go to the next slide. We're just passionate about education and children, and we believe that for children living in poverty, there's nothing better to change a life and to change the trajectory of a community and of a family than providing high-quality education that introduces you to the love of Christ as well. So that's what we're passionate about. Those are the 3 countries that we work in, and we just partner with local churches who have this calling to serve their children. And we help them build capacity, we help them train teachers, and we support students through scholarships. And that's about it. So that's the work part of my life. Now, some of you probably are kind of trying to play that guessing game, what's his accent? So I will tell you right now, I was born in Switzerland, I grew up in Paraguay, and now I live in Canada. My wife is from Quebec. So her parents only speak French, so at home we try to speak French, so I speak children's French. But so English is not my first language. Technically German is, because my parents spoke German. Spanish was in school, and then I moved here and had to learn English. And so it just all mixes together, and sometimes I'll be looking for a word, and it'll be there in the other 3 languages I have, and it just is what it is. But now you know, and you don't have to guess. And then the last thing you need to know about me is this, and I always tell this story, is when I was a youth pastor in Ontario, I took my young adults to a conference in this big church, and we had all these speakers. And there was this one speaker who I affectionately named the Yelly Baptist preacher. This is before I started preaching regularly. And once I started preaching regularly, my wife told me, you know, you've become the Yelly Mennonite preacher, because I grew up in the Mennonite tradition. And so if I yell, I apologize. It's just because I get excited. It's not because I'm angry. So I'm just going to shoot that ahead for you. And now we can get into the text, and I'm going to make sure I keep on time here today so we all get home for lunch, right? When Matt emailed me, and we can go to that next slide. We don't need that anymore. When Matt emailed me, and he said, Matthew 14, Jesus walking on the water, I thought, oh, easy peasy. That's actually one of the first sermons I've ever preached. It wasn't a German service. It was in German. And I've preached it several times since. It's one of my favorite kind of Bible passages about Jesus. So I thought, this is just absolutely fabulous. It's going to be easy. I can just kind of recycle something I have. And I'm passionate about this text anyways. I can just be here, and that's it. And so as I've been going through this text this week, though, the easy peasy part disappeared. And I've really been struggling with some things in this text and how to bring it across, because as I look back at what I used to say, especially when I was younger, I know I'm still young, but back then I was in my early 20s, now I'm in my mid-30s. Before I had kids and before, life happens, I used to come with all these easy kind of answers out of this text, these kind of glossed over kind of wisdoms that we can all take into our lives. And as I'm looking at the text today, and as I was looking at the words that I used to say, I thought, I'm not quite sure if I was completely right. So what I want to do today is I want to tell you 2 sides of the story. The side that I used to preach, and I'll shorten it, of course, where I'm struggling, and then I want to tell a story and maybe a little short application. So let's start with this text. Just some background. We're in Matthew 14, and we're in the middle of this section where Jesus is really going hard at having people try to understand who he is. You know, the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. And in that period between where the Old Testament ends and the New Testament begins, the intratestamental period where we don't really have any books in the Bible, we have other books that didn't make it into the Bible, they started to develop this kind of tradition, this kind of expectation that when the Messiah came, he would kind of be a new savior and liberator, kind of in the vein of what happened to Israel when they left Egypt. They had left slavery, they had left oppression, they had gotten their own land, and God had done it all through Moses and through Joshua, and God had kind of led them. And so the idea was that there was going to be this new Exodus, except this new Exodus, what it was going to look like, and I always call this affectionately, it was going to look like the Messiah was going to come to kick some Roman butt and just restore the land that was already there and free Israel, and that was it. And so when you read the Bible, when you read the New Testament specifically in Jesus, you'll always have these like Exodus echoes going on in the background. So here in Matthew 14, just before Jesus walks on the water, he's fed 5,000 people with a few fish and a few loaves of bread, which of course right away gets you back to the Exodus where manna comes from heaven every morning in the bird land at night so that there's enough meat and bread to eat. Then Jesus walks on the water. Then he has some more, Then he has some more kind of conversations, some more miracles. And then at the end of chapter 15, there's another feeding, this time of 4,000. So this whole kind of section is just bracketed by these two Exodus images of feeding people, of being saved, of receiving salvation. And so within it are these kind of little glimpses at who Jesus is. And one of these glimpses happens in this story. And so let me shoot ahead with you that I think that this whole story turns around Jesus saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And I will get to it in 2 seconds why. But anyways, Jesus is just shooing his disciples off. The word immediately doesn't show up in Matthew as much as it does in the book of Mark. In Mark, Jesus is always doing immediately or right away, or he's always in a hurry, not so much in Matthew, but here he is in a hurry. You've eaten, go on the boat, I'll deal with the crowds. I need to pray. And the disciples are on the lake. They're trying to row to the other side. We know if you go and you look at the lake, you'll see it's fairly round, and there's mountains or hills on each side. So it's kind of like a giant bowl. The water has nowhere to go. The wind comes down one side of the mountains and washes across the lake. The waves have nowhere to go. So if you shake this bowl, I sometimes do this with the pool my kids are in. I just really kick it from the side. It's just craziness. And so the disciples are kind of in this stormy-ish weather. They're just not making any progress towards land. It is early morning. Jesus passes by. They think it's a ghost, which for us in our tradition is shocking because we don't really believe in ghosts. And why would the disciples believe in ghosts? But there was all sorts of stories about this lake and what inhabited this lake. And it's, another one of the Gospels says it's the fourth watch, which means it's like almost dusk. And you've rowed the whole night and you've had a big miracle kind of day the day before, and you're tired and you start seeing all sorts of crazy things. And Jesus introduces himself and says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Why is that so central? The first time I read this, not the first time I read it, but the first time I worked on this for a sermon, I went back to some commentaries, and then I remembered that tiny bit of Greek that I still remembered from university, and I Googled the Greek version of this text because I wouldn't dare opening a Greek Bible because I wouldn't even get to this text there. And I found these two words where Jesus speaking. Jesus literally says this. He says, "Take heart, ego eimi." That's the Greek version. Do you want to repeat it with me so you remember it? Ego eimi. Okay. Take heart, ego eimi. Do not be afraid. Now, when we translate ego eimi in this version here and in most other Bibles, it says, "It is I." But somebody who would have been reading this story in the Greek would have had giant red warning lights go off as soon as ego eimi went off. Because they would also be reading the Old Testament in Greek. And they would be reading the story of Moses meeting God at the bush. And God giving him this command to go and liberate the Israelites. And Moses saying, "Who do I tell them sent me?" And God answers, "I am who I am," or "I will be who I will be," depending on how you want to translate the grammar of those words. Now, when you read that in Greek, so the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which a lot of the readers would have been doing, they would have been reading, "Ego eimi sent you." I am sent you. So here, in the midst of everything that's going on, Jesus says, "Do not be afraid, take heart, I am." It's not just, "Hey, I'm your buddy, remember me, I'm not a ghost." He's saying, "I am. I am God's Son. I am the Messiah. I am the promised one. I represent God. I am, in fact, part of the Trinity. I am. I'm God." Do you not see? Did you not just see the 5,000 people that ate? Do you not see who I am? I am. And I always loved Peter's response until this week. Because Peter just kind of goes and says, "Well, if you can do it, I can do it. Just tell me to go." And I always saw that as like a faith response. Peter says, "Go." Peter says, "Well, Jesus is doing it. He can call me out onto the waters because Jesus is I am. I can go as well if he tells me to go." And Jesus says, "Come." And Peter goes. And as soon as he sees the waves and the craziness, he looks down. He starts sinking. And then he cries out to Jesus. And Jesus takes him. "You of little faith." By the way, that gets repeated several times. It gets repeated just in the next chapter again, where Jesus says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And they walk back together to the boat. And so one version of how you could apply this text, of course, is this idea that God meets us where we are. He oftentimes meets us in these stormy periods, and if we just have enough patience and time and courage and maybe quietness to look, we recognize God's presence. And then he calls us out, of course. He calls us out onto the waters. He calls us out into the wildness. He calls us out into the storm to follow him. And as long as we keep our eye on God, he will walk with us. It's when we lose sight of God, when we lose sight of Jesus, that it seems like everything starts crashing in. After I preached that for the first time, I realized there's also a book that John Ortberg wrote that says, if you want to walk on water, you just have to get out of the boat. I didn't know that back then. I have never actually read the book, but I assume it says some of the same things. And maybe some of us are sitting here today and we really need to hear that. I don't want to take that message away because it's an important message. I do believe that God calls us to do hard things, that following Jesus, being a disciple, isn't just fun. And I also do believe that sometimes the comfort of where we are in, even though we're making no progress, even though we're sitting in that boat and it's not moving forward and it's being battered by the waves, and out there is God calling us to something new. The comfort of what we know sometimes is as powerful as the presence of divinity over here. Maybe sometimes we do need to get out of that boat. We do need to walk on those waves and on that water, and we do need to keep our face on God. But here is where tensions came in for me this week. Because as I was reading it again, I got stuck with two things. The first thing was Peter's response. That response that I've always found so courageous, so brilliant. If I'm a very outspoken person, you may notice this by now. I'm also fairly rash. sometimes, and I speak way more quickly than I should, and I've always kind of really related to Peter, because he's all those things as well. And I've always thought how great that there's one disciple who is kind of, where I can say, hey, I can see myself in that. And they're not all just, perfect. They're not all just Matthews or Johns, Some of them are Peters. Great. But as I'm looking at this story, I wonder whether Peter represents also sometimes the worst things in what we do. Because we do not actually get an insight into what Jesus wanted to achieve with this whole thing. If you read the same story in another gospel, it says Jesus was actually intending to pass them by. And he gets kind of stopped by the disciples, and then the whole story happens. Matthew doesn't tell us that story. He just says Jesus is walking and they see him and he chats with them. But what did Jesus want? Did Jesus want to show them who he is? Did he want to introduce himself as divine and that's it? Did he want Peter to come out? Or was there another plan? We don't know. Peter just kind of says, oh, I can do what you're doing too if you just help me, Lord, which is great. But there is no question, Lord, what should we do? There's just like, tell me to come, and I'll come. And this is sometimes what happens in my life, is that I just go. I shoot ahead, and I hope that Jesus will follow. I hope that Jesus will go. One of the things that a preacher that I've heard once said, don't go and ask God to bless the things you are doing. Go find the things that God is doing, because those things are already blessed. And I feel like what this story maybe shows us is that Peter is kind of doing the opposite. He's just doing something and saying, if you tell me to, I want to, if you tell me to, I will, I know it'll be good because it'll be blessed. And sometimes we do this. We just go barrel ahead. We don't even take the time to think about what God's revelation in our lives mean. And then when they come back to the boat, the whole story ends with the disciples saying, first it says they worshipped him, and then they say, truly you are the Son of God. So once again on the surface, a wonderful confession of faith. A wonderful kind of revelation. Yeah, you are the Son of God. Look what we've seen up till now. We just came back from feeding 5,000 people with a couple of loaves of bread and a little bit of fish. And now this, you are truly the Son of God. But I wonder whether this isn't just a little statement of irony at the end of this story. Because it's truly very easy to say, yes, you are the Son of God, when you've just had these massive miracles happen in front of you. Are you still saying that, disciples? A couple of days or weeks, a couple of chapters later, as Jesus is being carted off to stand trial, to go to the cross? Are you still saying that this is the Son of God? Are you still happy with that at that point? Or did you make a mistake? Do they know what they say, what they mean when they say you are the Son of God? See, I felt for myself that I oftentimes have a very easy time to worship and to acknowledge God's presence and divinity and grace in my life when I'm on that high, when I've seen something that God is doing. But hey, when life just goes back to the old normal ways, and God is quiet or absent, or maybe I'm just too loud that I can't hear and see, am I still saying, yeah, you are the Son of God? There's a reason why Jesus' story doesn't end on that boat. There's a reason why later the crowds will say, crucify him. They want the Jesus of the walking on the water and the feeding of the 5,000, but they do not want the Jesus who turns the other cheek. They do not want the Jesus who goes to the cross. They do not want the Jesus who refuses to kick some Roman butt. They want the Jesus of power. But the Jesus of love and justice, the Jesus that doesn't come just for the Jewish people, but for the whole world, that's a tougher pill to swallow. Some tensions that I found. How am I doing for time? Has somebody kept track for me? I'm good? Alrighty, sounds good. You can yell and let me know, right? I thought I'd think a little bit more about what that means for our lives, and so I wanted to share a story with you from my work. I'm going to go to that next slide. I want to introduce you to my friend Jose. Jose is a pastor in a community in Honduras called Chamelecon. Now, Jose started to pastor this church years and years ago, and he started it out. You know, this is a poor community, lots of poverty. There was a gang kind of ruling the area, and he was called to plant this church and start going. And he noticed that within his youth group at church, he had lots of girls, less boys, and they were really committed to their faith. But they kept getting pregnant. They were 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. They kept getting pregnant. The parents, the dads were nowhere to be found. They were often in the gangs or gone. And so him and his wife got together and they said, what do we need to do? Because we've talked, these kids know the love of Jesus Christ, but they're not escaping the cycle of poverty, where the women are left to fend for themselves with the children and barely survive, and another cycle starts. And so they started a school. He told me there's like a cutoff date where I've noticed that within my church we haven't had teenage pregnancies anymore. And it's related to when our children started going to school. A few years ago, another gang came into town, and a gang war started. And at one point, Jose was on his knees in front of these gang leaders, a gun pointed at him, and he was told, you have to stop. And so he stopped. I asked his kids how that time was. They said every day we heard gunshots. Gunshots were everywhere. If we left our house, if we had to leave our house, we would walk with our heads down like this and just not look up. Don't give anybody any reason to talk to you. At night, you heard the gunshots. You just turn the other way and hope they don't make it through your house and you don't get hit. Eventually, one gang won and the other gang lost. And now, what was once the most dangerous place in America to live is less so because one gang has won. You can't talk to any family without them telling you how many people they've lost to the gang wars. Jose started the school back up, and thanks to Canadian donors, we were able to build second floors around the whole school. And then in November, December 2020, what you see on this picture happened. He's standing on the roof of his church, and the water was close to 6 feet high at that point, and this was after the second of 2 hurricanes came through this community within a span of 3 weeks. What happens in many poor countries is that the poor people don't have land, so they go and take land, and the only land that's usually available is close to a river, and it's low-lying, and every time there's a storm, everything floods. So this community is actually lower-lying from the river. So once the river crests, it's just downhill all the way into this community. And so one way of telling Jose's story is that of God's presence and divinity and faithfulness. Because thanks to the second floor that this school had, the elderly people who couldn't be saved in time stayed on that second floor. We have videos of them worshiping, we have videos of them making food and just waiting for the waters to recede, and they had to do this twice within 3 weeks. And then we kind of sent out an appeal, and people just responded because people just wanted to help. And they didn't just clean up the school, they cleaned up the streets around the school, they helped all the neighbors, and we're now in the process of renovating a third building that was destroyed by the floods that was given to the school. That's one way of telling that story. The second way of telling that story is that Jose is standing on that roof, and he told me I didn't even notice that people were taking a picture of me, because in that moment, I was having it out with God. He said, at that moment, I was ready to walk away. I was done. He had seen God's presence. If you ask him the stories, he has seen what God can do. He has seen the miracles. He has seen the feeding of the 5,000 or the walking on water. He has seen what happens. He has met God. But standing on that roof after 2 floods, he just said, I was wondering, what am I doing here? Why am I even here? Maybe God doesn't want this. Maybe I did this on my own. Maybe it's time for me to just walk away. Maybe we just give up. So when I thought of my friend Jose, and I thought of this story, I thought, we are probably somewhere in these 2 stories. Somewhere in the middle, maybe. Some of us are waiting to see God, and we're ready to go where he calls us to. And some of us have seen God, but then it's worn off, it's slowed down, life happened, some bad things happened, and we're wondering what's going on. We felt like it was easy to say, truly you are God, truly you are the Son of God, truly I have met Jesus at that high moment. But we didn't really know what that confession meant for when things went bad. You know, Jose told me he didn't get a real answer on that roof. It's not like Jesus now came down with that heavenly voice and said, Jose, keep going. Not like Jesus walked on the water in front of him and said, follow me. He just had it out. And he came off the roof and he said, we keep going. That's it. When you talk to him today, I don't think he's the same person that he was before that. He does carry a certain heaviness with him now. He's more tired. And he knows it can happen again. There was a hurricane warning just a few weeks ago, and they evacuated everything. And luckily, or by God's grace, the hurricane turned and didn't hit Honduras. It's not like every encounter with God looks like Jesus walking on the water, calling us out onto that water. Sometimes it's no answer at all, but just a realization that God is calling, and I'll follow even when it's tough. And that's discipleship, my friends. We encounter the living God, and sometimes we don't even know what it means until life hits us and we follow anyways. And by the grace of God through Jesus Christ, God goes with us. Even when we're tired and when we're angry and when we're frustrated. We were just reminded today in the morning that we have forgiveness. And the forgiveness of God walks with us. Even when we don't know what we meant when we said, yes, that is Jesus. And that's all I have for us today. I wish I could resolve it more neatly for all of us. But I hope we find ourselves in there somewhere. Thank you.